Thank you very much. So we've done our introduction on epilepsy in the brain and stuff, and we're really for the rest of today going to focus on TAND, and I'll explain to you as I go along how we're going to do that during the course of my presentation. And I guess the first thing for me to do is really just to say greetings to everybody from beautiful Cape Town. How many of you have been to Cape Town? Yes, all the ones in the front row, good. So you're very welcome to visit me. This is Table Mountain, and here you can see the University of Cape Town, the kind of upper campus we call it, and my clinic, in fact, the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry is right here. We're right here at the foot of the mountains on Rondebosch Common. So this is where I'm based and where I'm spending most of my time. Mika is saying she wants the microphone like this. I'm not a K-pop artist, Mika. I'll do my best. But many of you also know, and maybe this is what Serge was hinting at, that I was born in South Africa, but I spent 20 years living and training in Cambridge. And this is very much where my tuberous sclerosis story started, when I did a PhD on TSC and have continued to do research in tuberous sclerosis ever since then. So this is my 21st anniversary of being in TSC. I think it's a very important place in that sense in my story. I have to give you my conflict of interest as well. I'm not going to talk specifically about any detailed trials or things like that, but I will give a few examples. So just so that it's actually clear, I was involved in all three the EXIST trials funded by Novartis. I'm part of the TOSCA study. And as you heard, I'm one of the authors. It's never one, things don't get developed by one person. It's a team of people. I was perhaps the lead developer of the TAND checklist, but it's a free tool. So we had zero budget to make it, and we get zero money to give it to you. But any money that I got, I always give away to other people. So we're going to talk about TAND for the rest of today, but as you already heard from Carla at the start of the meeting, we are also going to be remembering Loren Leclezio. And so I thought I should at least build in a little bit about Loren during the course of my presentation, just so that she's part of it. You'll be pleased to hear that we told her husband, or in fact we asked his permission right at the start, whether we could dedicate the meeting to Loren, and he was delighted. And I let him know when I was on the train on my way here that it's happening, and he sent his best wishes, and he said her memory will live on. And so I really think that that's what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve. So here she is, beautiful picture, beautiful woman, my Bond girl, as Mika said. She worked in health communication in the corporate sector before she then did a degree in psychology, an honors in neuropsychology, and then she came to me to do her master's in something related to neuroscience. And I very much always say to people, I didn't recruit her, she recruited me. She was a woman who knew her mind, and I was very clear that she was interviewing me for this job as a master's student rather than the other way around. And so that's how our story started. Here you can see Loren in the context of Tuberous Sclerosis International. So many people in the room are members of TSCI. This is an organization for all the parent organizations around the world who work with people with TSC wherever they are. And some of them are smiling because they're actually on the photograph. Can you see yourselves, people? But here's Loren next to me. Here's Carla, who's introduced us, and some other familiar faces in the room. The reason I wanted to show this picture is one of the things that was really important to Loren is to work with and in the community of people who live with TSC. We've really changed in our approach to research in recent decades. Rather than to do research on communities of people with diseases, we now work and do research with communities of people who live with the disorder. And that's really a matter then of bringing our technical expertise about, say, TSC, together with a lived expertise that families and individuals who live with these conditions have. The same has happened in autism, the same is happening in many other mental health and neurodevelopmental disabilities. And that's something that Loren felt very, very passionate about. And as I tell you the story, every time that we sat in my office and we talked about her research, and I would ask her something, she would say, well, let's find out what people in the community want. And that was really the theme of a lot of her work and part, I think, of her legacy. So let me start with why we created this term TAND. You've already heard us talk about it. And the story is known to you, but it's just worth reminding us where it came from. We know from our data, from many other people's work, that most people with TSC will have some neuropsychiatric manifestations at some point in their lives. Most, 90%. In my view, I think everybody that I've met with TSC has some neurodevelopmental or neuropsychiatric manifestations. But let's say 9 out of 10. So it means it's as common as the epilepsies and as many other physical manifestations that we see. But when we did a survey of people in the UK TSC community some years ago and asked them, how many of you have had any assessment or treatment for any of these psychiatric or neurodevelopmental problems, the answer was fewer than 1 in 5. So most people, even though we'd written guidelines, they were published, peer-reviewed, journaled, all the things that as scientists we always think are the right things to do, most people never had any assessment and never had any treatment. And so that was a concern for us. Most people have problems, most people don't get anything. Why is that the case? And the third reason that was the background to coming up with this term was we also realized that around the international community and in different professions and different communities, people use different words and different terms to refer to different things. And I'm going to show you some words that are familiar to us. I forgot to start my timer. So these are the sort of words that if you're in health or in mental health or in education, you might use. Cognition, cognitive, we've already heard about that in the context of this morning's work. Behavior, neurocognition, neurobehavioral, neuropsychological, psychiatric, mental health. Do you use these sorts of words? Yeah? And here's one that we heard this morning, and actually we're really trying to encourage people never to use it. The word mental retardation or its equivalent. Because it's a term that in the intellectual disability community, families have said to us, we really don't like this word, and can you please use the word intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disability? And so people use the same words to mean different things and different words to mean the same things, and so we thought we need to find a way just to have a shared language to talk about all these difficulties. And so those were the 3 reasons why we decided to come up with this concept of TAND, the name TAND. So we made it up. Anne won't want to admit it, but she's the one, when we were looking for a name in the international panel, and I said, we need an acronym. Anne said, well, why don't we just call it TSC-associated neuropsychiatric disorders? And we all went, okay. So if you want to blame anybody, here she is. And so we say, and you've already heard Lisbeth say that TAND is an umbrella term for the full range of biological, psychological, and social challenges that we may see in association with tuberous sclerosis. And what I'm going to do is I'm just quickly going to show you the different levels. They're all kind of theoretically, conceptually different levels, but related levels. And I will just give you some examples of the key things that we typically look for and see in tuberous sclerosis. So the first level, do you like the animations? Yeah, I like them too. I didn't make them. The first conceptual level is the behavioral level. Often people overinterpret the word behavior. We want to make it a diagnosis in itself. Oh, it's a behavioral disorder. I don't think there is such a thing as a behavioral disorder. Behaviors are the symptoms and the manifestations that people come to us with. I'm worried about my child because they're anxious. I'm worried because they're overactive. I'm worried because they're inattentive. I'm worried because they're not sleeping. I'm worried because they're not speaking. These are the observed behaviors that we see. And in TSC, we see a full range. Almost everything you can imagine. Aggression, tantrums, anxiety, self-injury, inattention, language, eye contact, social difficulties, sleep. And people who live with TSC will tell you that this is what we see. Some of those are correlated with, say, overall level of intellectual ability or with epilepsy, but not all of them are directly related to those. So some are more likely when you have seizures, or some are more likely when you have intellectual disability, but none of them are exclusively present in the one or the other. The next conceptual level is what we call the psychiatric level. This is when we're now going to take the symptoms that mum and dad brings to the clinic and say, I'm worried my child is inattentive and they're very restless and they're very fidgety, and then we're going to use psychiatric diagnostic systems and procedures like DSM or ICD to say, is there enough of it for long enough, to the exclusion of other things, in the context of other factors, and that we use our systems and our diagnostic systems, therefore, to reach a psychiatric diagnosis. And in TSC, the most common ones that we see are autism spectrum disorder. About 40% or 50% of people have and meet criteria for an autism spectrum disorder. We're going to come back to that in a minute. About the same percentage of people meet criteria for ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Particularly during teen and into adult years, then anxiety disorders and depressive disorders are the very prominent emerging psychiatric disorders in adulthood. But just to bring back the point, I did a study many years ago of attention deficits and ADHD in TSC. And we surveyed all the kids in East Anglia region, and I diagnosed 55% of them with ADHD. Only one of them had ever received a clinical diagnosis and had ever received treatment. Only one. Similarly, Julia Lewis, a colleague in Wales, did a study of adults with normal intellectual ability, and she assessed them in a systematic way for anxiety disorders. She diagnosed 60% of these normally intelligent adults with TSC with an anxiety disorder. Not one of them had received a clinical diagnosis or treatment. Not one. Can you see the discrepancies between actual dilemmas and what happens in real life? Our next conceptual level then is the intellectual level. So this is where we're now going to do an IQ-based assessment or IQ type assessments and see how people fall on a normal distribution. And we're going to say you're either in the normal range or you have some degree of intellectual disability. As you will know, about half of people with TSC have normal intellectual ability, and about half have some degree of intellectual disability. And that's just broadly speaking, so numbers are kind of 45 or so % normal intellectual ability, but half and half is a good enough way to remember it. But what's perhaps even more important is we see very unusual profiles of intellectual ability in people with TSC. So saying somebody has an IQ of 100 tells us very little about their individual intellectual strengths and weaknesses. So my clinical tip to you is not just to ask for a number, but to look at the profile of where are people better and worse in their intellectual profiles, because that might tell you much more about their ability to function, why they might present with difficulties at certain places and at certain times. So that's the intellectual level. You can see how it relates to those. This is a very predictive level of problems at many of the other levels, but it's separate from all the other ones. Our fourth level is the academic level. This is when we're going to talk about scholastic skills, reading, writing, spelling, mathematics. What's the most common scholastic difficulty that people with TSC have? Mathematics. Why, we don't know, but if you're going to guess, it's going to be maths. That's the most common observation that we make. And one can speculate why that might be. But the key reason why this is a separate level is very often in real life, kids are in school with TSC, they have normal intellectual abilities, they're struggling academically, and the feedback they get is, well, you are very bright, you should be able to do it, you should just try harder. That's often the kind of message that people with TSC get. Instead of thinking, you are at very high risk of having specific scholastic difficulties. In the Tosca study that you heard from Ann, we asked how many people in the Tosca cohort had any scholastic difficulties. And the answer was almost 60%. So the majority of people with TSC, regardless of their intellectual ability, have or have had scholastic challenges or academic difficulties. The next conceptual level is the neuropsychological level, and I'll talk a bit more about it later. But this is where we're going to look at brain-referenced systems, how the brain specializes to do certain tasks, like memory skills, like attentional skills, like executive brain skills. And I'm not going to talk much about it now because I will focus on it in a second. Again, important because particularly in individuals with TSC who have completely normal intellectual ability, these are often the things that are specific areas of weaknesses that can have a profound impact on people's ability to function in school, to function in jobs, and to be able to have a productive life. I'll talk more about it later. And then the final level is the psychosocial level. So this is, and it should almost be the outside of the umbrella, perhaps, because everything in terms of living with a chronic condition or a genetic disorder has to be seen in the context of the impact that it has on people's real lives. Family stress, parent stress. TSC is associated with incredibly high levels of parental stress. Inter-parent relationship difficulties, sibling relationship difficulties, self-esteem issues, all those kind of problems. And the reason it was important for us to put it into the tree is unless we ask people about it, unless we give people permission to talk about the impact of this thing on their lives, we will not be able to really understand the quality of life that people are able to lead with a chronic condition like TSC. So these are the 6 levels of TAND in the umbrella. And the first thing we recommended when we wrote those international guidelines in 2012 was to say, everybody with TSC should be screened for TAND at least once a year. So screening means a quick check. It's not a detailed evaluation. At least once a year. And then if you pick up something, you should then do a focused assessment and intervention. So if you screen and you pick up anxiety, then you should look into it and figure out what needs to be done, for example. And this was the point. And in fact, Loren was already part of she started working with me in 2012, so when we had the 2012 conference, she was already in the background thinking about her work. And we then asked people, some of these guys, about what do you think of the recommendation and what do you think would be useful. And the main thing, the first message that TSCI and people in the TSC community said to us is, can you please give us, and particularly the doctors, a tool to help them do the screening? Because nobody really knows how to do it. And that was the reason why we came up with and made up the TAND checklist. And the purpose of the TAND checklist was to give non-mental health experts a structure, a framework to have a conversation with families about TAND. So this is not a diagnostic instrument. I'm sorry, Sergio, you didn't mean the word diagnostic when you said it, but it's meant to be a guideline. It's an aide-de-memoire for those of you who are francophone. It's so that the doctor, who might be a dermatologist or a kidney doctor or an adult neurologist or a nephrologist, can sit down and just go through and say, let's just talk about these things and figure out what we can do to help get you to the next step. And it's exactly all those levels that I've just outlined to you. They're mostly simple yes-no questions. It takes about 10 minutes or so to do. If it's somebody you know well, it can be faster. If it's a new first assessment, it can sometimes take a bit longer for people to do that. And we deliberately made it free and open access so that anyone, mums, dads, doctors, grannies, grandpas, can download it and use it in some way. And Loren was the one, so she was one of the authors on the actual TAND and TAND checklist paper, and she was the one who did all the initial work to validate it. And so that is, she went to professionals in the TSC community and said, what are the components that should be there? Are they right? Are they clear? Are they comprehensive, etc.? And she went to family experts in the TSC community and said to them the same. Is it clear? Is it the right stuff? Are there gaps? Are there things we should change? And so it was a very participatory process that Loren led to get to the pilot validation of the instrument. And Loren was the one who came into my office one day and said, okay, you are going to make a little movie to illustrate the TAND checklist to people who may not be that familiar of how to do a basic interview. And she's one of the people who always said to me, don't assume that the things that you take for granted are necessarily things that everybody else will know. And I think that helps us as specialists. We always think, oh, I'm not a specialist in this thing, but actually some of the fundamental things we know can be helpful to somebody from a different professional group or different background. So anyone can, and if you want to send colleagues to look at it, I talk a bit about it and then I interview, and this is actually a mum in Cape Town who allowed me to interview her about her young daughter. And so we went back to TSCI And Loren went back to the community and said, so what do you think? Is this fine? What do you need next? And of course, the next thing people then said is, can you please translate it? Because we're from all over the world. You think everybody understands English, but it's not true. And that was the reason why we then started the process of translations. I'm pleased to report that the first language was Dutch. Swedish was next, then German, Polish. I don't know if we can interpret the speed at which different languages do their translations, but I'm also pleased to report that as I was sitting here this morning, the French version popped into my inbox. So as from today, we also have a French TAND checklist for you to use. So at least in this part of the world, we now have Dutch, French, and English, which should cover, I would like to think, many of you in the room. And we're still working on the Greek. We've just finished the Japanese, in fact, Hebrew and a few other languages that aren't on there. Who can tell me what this language is? And if you can read it even better? Any guesses? Japanese. Very good. This one was published just before the Japanese conference. That was our goal. I can read TSC and I can read TAND. Where is it? Somewhere. There's TAND. There you go. Okay. And so the second recommendation from our consensus was to say, apart from the kind of screening that we want everyone to have on an annual basis, at key developmental time points, because we know everyone is at risk of TAND, we should find a way of doing a comprehensive evaluation of the TAND profile of people. So this is not just a quick check, this is now something more detailed. And we're recommending that it should be done across all levels in these key time points. So during infancy, so in the first 3 years of life, because that's when autism, intellectual disability is most likely to occur, the language disorders that Sergis was talking about likely to occur. And it also helps us to prepare for preschool years so that we know where the baseline is. The next is then in preschool years, and this kind of, it's different in different countries in the preschool years, to make sure that we place you in an appropriate environment for your educational journey, as much as we can judge, at least at the time. Then in primary school years, to prepare for middle or secondary school, during primary school years, that's often when scholastic difficulties, ADHD, these sorts of manifestations present, even if they may not have been there before. And then again, in secondary years, so in adolescence, to plan for transition to adult life, but also because we know this is when many of those mood disorders and anxiety disorders become particularly problematic. Interestingly, we find that that's also when we often diagnose people with high-functioning autism, or whatever word or term you use now in this part of the world, high-functioning ASD, because they've managed just about to get through during primary years, and then when they make through to secondary age, suddenly the scaffolding and support is different, and then it becomes clear that there's actually an autism spectrum disorder present. So that can be very difficult to access appropriate services at that age. And then in early adulthood, the highest risk age for people who live with TSC is that transitional age into early adulthood. How do I become more independent? As you know, most countries have good services for kids until they're about 18, and then almost nothing. Certainly when they need additional supports for development, for other kind of challenges. So that's a key time for us to look at the needs and try and figure out a support plan. And then after that, as required. And the third recommendation we made was, if you see change, unexpected, unpredictable change in any of these TAND manifestations, you should do an urgent physical workup. And I'll give you an example. 15-year-old boy, normal intellectual ability, never had any major difficulties at a behavioral level, and suddenly he starts to become irritable and aggressive in school. What did the teacher say? Oh, he's a teenager, it's teenage behavior. And it continued until it got so severe that he attacked the teacher one day and was kicked out of school. And the mum came, and that's when he was referred to me. And the mum said, this is not my son. He has never been like this. There's something different. And of course, one of the thoughts we had, and the question I asked is, when last did he have an MRI scan? And the answer was when he was 3. And so we repeated his MRI scan, and indeed, he had a growing SAGA. And the SAGA is the kind of manifestation that can actually lead to these changes in behavior, aggression, irritability, changes. You've already heard from An about that. We monitored him, he had growth, we did SAGA surgery, and he was able to go back into his mainstream school after the SAGA surgery. Just one example, but think about those kind of things. Changes in seizure control, seizure patterns, sleep, academic, behavioral, particularly in people who have intellectual disability. Those might be your markers for physical changes in needs rather than the need for risperidone or a psychiatric assessment in the first instance. So these were the guidelines, these are the recommendations. If you try to do any of those, I think you're doing a great job. And again, we went back to the TSC community because by now Loren was actually getting a little bit concerned. And Loren's concern, in a way, was then borne out by people in the TSC community. Loren was saying to me she was getting a bit overwhelmed by all these things. And because there are just so many things to think about, and it's just so, overwhelming. Everyone has their own profile, and how can we understand that? And in fact, when we went to the TSCI community, that was exactly what people said to us too. You've now translated the TAND checklist, but TSC is so overwhelmingly unique in people. And just maybe, just again, here's our little umbrella. Not everyone with TSC has all these things. But everyone has a pattern, you might have a bit of this and a bit of that and not of that, and then someone who has this and that one, etc. And so this, because it's so unique, and no one's been able to see any patterns, of course, on one hand, it means that each of us is an individual, and we need to come up with an individual plan. That's what we teach us, medical students, etc. But what it did in real life is it actually made people just feel paralyzed. I don't know what to do. It's all too much. And they did nothing. And I think that's in part why so many people didn't have any really good evaluations. And that was really, I think, for us, an implementation challenge, because we realized unless we can find a way, it must be a call for surgery. I think there's another urgent assessment for you to do. I think it was a child who became aggressive, and they now need to see you urgently, right? And so Loren and I had thought about it, and of course we realized that one can have top-down approaches. So the way that I've presented to you the TAND umbrella is a kind of a top-down structure. These are conceptually how we think in the business, biopsychosocially, different levels, and that's what we've imposed on the TSC community so far. A kind of, this is what we think, let's structure it like that. But of course, increasingly in neuroscience, in mental health, people are also realizing that we've made up all these categories and diagnoses. We don't know how things might naturally occur in real life. And so you can use a bottom-up strategy to see, well, how do things actually present at a dimensional level in real life? And maybe it looks the same and maybe it looks completely different. But the idea that Loren and I then had was to say, maybe we could find natural clusters of TAND manifestations. And maybe, if ideally, our fantasy was if we could find fewer than 10 natural clusters, then we can say to doctors and families, look for these 10 things, and this is what we're then going to do about them. I was very simplistic. I thought, well, all doctors can count up to 10, right? So if we can keep it under 10, that's good. And so that was the idea, that if we could find clusters, then maybe that could help us with screening and diagnosis and psychoeducation. Maybe it might tell us some scientific information as well. And so that's where, by now, we're in Loren's PhD, where her PhD project came from. Here, I show you this panel. These are 20 people with TSC. Each column is a person with TSC. And across the rows are some TAND manifestations. And if it's green, it means it wasn't a problem. And if it's red, it means it was a problem. And as you can see, there's not really... Can anyone see a particular pattern? I mean, maybe there are some who have reds for almost everything. Yes. And maybe there are a few who have greens for almost everything. But probably doesn't help us that much to say you're really severely affected or you're really not severely affected. And so that was the question. But of course, all these new computational methodologies that we can use in science can help us see patterns that our eyes can't see. And so that's what Loren did. She did a little pilot study with 56 people in South Africa and Australia. And she used all sorts of different, some of them haven't even appeared on here, different kind of cluster analysis methodologies. This is just to make your eyes water because they look so complicated. And finally, what Loren was able to do was to find a method that could take those 56 people and all their TAND checklist data, and it was able to identify 6 clusters of manifestations. This is methods we use in genetics, but it's never really been used in behavioral science. And she then, and here you can see it's like a tree that shows if you're going to have something, what are you most likely also to have at the same time, and what are you least likely to have also at the same time. And so there are ways in which you can then see how these things, how likely they are to co-occur if one thing is present. And most of you will be familiar with factor analysis, so what we then did is we then combined cluster methods and factor analysis methods. This is published, so if any of you are interested in the paper, it's an open access paper in pediatric neurology from this year. Just put in Loren's name. And so her first pilot finding was basically that she could find some natural clusters. Of course, 56 people isn't an answer. And so what we needed to do was then to do exactly the same in a larger group. And in fact, Belgium was part of the extension study because these guys in the front contributed participants, and we had 2 sites from the USA, Australia, and South Africa. And so we had almost 500 people. We did exactly the same, applied the same methodologies. And what Loren found was that we could find 7 natural clusters. Of all the complex uniqueness in TSC, there seems to mean we've now replicated it on 2 separate data sets. It looks as though we can find about 7 groups of things. And I'll just briefly tell you what they are. Some of them will be similar to the groups I mentioned at the levels. Some are a little bit different. But this is what the data tells us rather than what we wanted the data to tell us. So firstly, a very clear and a very separate scholastic or academic group, reading, writing, spelling, maths. Very distinct from anything else. And they tend to cluster very closely. Next, an overactive, impulsive, restless group. Impulsive behavior, overactivity, restlessness. A very separate neuropsychological group with things like executive memory, attention difficulties, etc. A very separate little aggression and temper tantrum group. We call it dysregulated behaviors group. And if we talk to mums and dads, they would all go, yep, that's a big one, these dysregulated things. A separate mood and anxiety cluster. A separate eating-sleeping cluster. But you can see here, eating and sleeping, the way that it's shown visually here, it means it also talks to a number of other things. It's not as separate from many other things. It talks to many of the other things. Similarly, some of those other guys, you can see they talk to one another. So they're not totally independent, but they are clusters in their own right. And then a big autism-related cluster that you can see overlaps with many of the other clusters. So 7 clusters of findings. Here you can see Loren, this was the first time she presented the pilot data at IMFA, which is the Autumn Conference, and this was in Baltimore a few years ago. Ilse, you might have been there, I suspect. Here's Loren, this is the attentive. She was listening to me presenting her data. I was very nervous. But she had just had an operation, so she didn't want to present. This was in DC last year. And this is the picture that you've seen. So this is when she presented the final data last year at the SSPP conference in Leiden. And she did an amazing presentation. So here they are, 7 clusters. And what we're hoping it might be able to do is, at a simplistic, practical, clinical level, help families and help clinicians just use the cluster approach to identify challenges, to think about how we can screen for, how we can evaluate, and how we should treat. And for that reason, we've decided that what we're going to do today is, if we think about approaches to, I should say, assessment and treatment, is to use the cluster structure for the rest of today. And so I'm going to start by talking a bit to you about the hyperactive impulsivity cluster, just about a bit more detail and approaches to that. I'll say something about the neuropsychological cluster, and then we're going to move on to the other clusters. Lucy will talk about this regulated one next. I think then we have lunch, and then after lunch, You're going to hear Ilse and Anna and others talk about the ASD, the mood, the scholastic, and the eat-sleep cluster. Okay. Does that give you a sense of what we're doing for the rest of today? And is it logical, therefore, now for you, the difference between the original TAND, tree and umbrella, and how we got to the clusters? Because sometimes people are a bit confused about those two. Great. So let me see how we're doing for time, Anne.
7 minutes.
I have 7 minutes left?
You have...
7 minutes plus some more. Okay, good. I'll stop when I'm finished. So briefly, there's not much to say about the hyperactive impulsive cluster. Are there any parents here or people who live with TSC? How many of you or family members have had overactivity? So this is now the TAND checklist. Overactivity, hyperactivity, restlessness, or impulsivity? Yeah? Okay. Are you counting yourself? So these are the 3 items in that particular cluster. For those of you who are ADHD experts, you might notice that these are 3 of the key things that we often look for in ADHD: hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. But you will see that inattention is not actually in this cluster. Inattention groups with the neuropsychological stuff. So that's already an interesting separation at a practical level for us. But if we look at these phenomena in relation to intellectual ability, as I've shown you, people with TSC have a broad range. You can see, yes, if you have some degree of intellectual disability, you're very likely to have overactivity, restlessness, impulsivity. You can see here the rates are the majority. 50 to 70% of people with TSC with intellectual disability also have some of these. But even in those with completely normal intellectual ability, at least 1 in 3, at least a third, have some of these manifestations. And so the message is it's very common. It's very often not identified and thought about. But, and I hope Lucy will talk about it, we haven't coordinated, hyperactivity and impulsivity is a risk marker for lots of other things, particularly for dysregulated behaviors. Are you going to say that again? She will. So remember it. Phew. Okay. And so a practical suggestion about if you have phenomena in that cluster is to say, well, think about ADHD and do a proper diagnostic workup for ADHD. As you know, many people meet criteria, most don't get a diagnosis because people would say, oh, it's just TSC. Oh, he's just a boy. Oh, he's going to grow out of this overactivity. They don't. They grow into it rather than out of it. And then there are a range of treatment options. So ADHD, if it's mild to moderate, international, certainly European guidelines at the moment would say that we would use behavioral and other approaches to help people develop attentional skills, classroom-based activities, occupational activities. And if it's severe, then we would actually add stimulant medication to the treatment plan. Never on its own, but add it to the treatment plan. Interestingly, often in TSC, people are scared to use stimulants because there's this theoretical concern about seizures and worsening seizures. But I've never seen a worsening of seizures on stimulant medication. Of course, you have to be careful with all the physical manifestations, etc. But the message to clinicians and to families is consider an assessment for ADHD and consider appropriate treatments for ADHD as well. I don't know how much of a problem it is here. Maybe in the discussion section we could talk about that. Many families ask us, well, what practical things can we do? And this is quite a good book. I don't get royalties from this. It's just a book that I've used in clinical practice by a woman called Sandra Reef. It's called How to Reach and Teach Children and Teens with ADHD or ADD. The term ADD is not a diagnostic one. It's not an ICD or DSM. But basically, kids who have attentional problems and or meet criteria for ADHD, which would be many with TSC. And they talk about classroom arrangement, how you can help kids practice not being fidgety and deal with those sorts of things and help increase attention span and all those sorts of practical things that I think are really the kind of activities that mums and dads are looking for. It works for adults and it works for husbands and wives too, just in case you're wondering. So let me now just spend the last few minutes a bit about the neuropsychological cluster. So this is the second one. So these are the items in the TAND checklist. And all of them except the last one cluster in that group. Memory, such as remembering things, attention difficulties, concentrating, dual tasking, the most common one of all, visuospatial difficulties, and executive difficulties, planning set shifting, etc. And then plus difficulty paying attention. So if you see in clinic somebody who struggles paying attention and mum and dad says this is hard for them, think about what's happening at a neuropsychological level, because that might be the best level of explanation of these sorts of challenges. I don't know how many of you are experts on neuropsychology. I don't want to do the bit if you... We have a few neuropsychologists in the room. Good. Okay, good. So for the psychiatrists in the room, that might just be me, very simplistically, a neuropsychological approach tries to say we know where different aspects of learning and memory happen, and we can measure the strengths and weaknesses of the brain of an individual using a range of different evaluation tools. And very simplistically, we divide the brain up into front and back, left and right, inside and outside. Does that make sense? You can see I have to think simplistically about these things. And we know, specialized, most of us have language skills specialized on the left, have visuospatial skills specialized towards the right, have information systems towards the back, have production or executive systems towards the front of the brain. And the up-down, the inside-outside is just about regulatory functions are very subcortical inside the brain, and the more knowledge-based systems are more cortical. Now, of course, our brains don't look like that. They're obviously networks and connections, and you've seen some of these beautiful pictures by Dr. Vries, so it's quite a complicated system, so I don't want to oversimplify it. But at a practical neuropsychological level, what we do is we evaluate all these different functional brain systems in a clinical setting with a neuropsychologist or a clinical psychologist, and we try to see whether people are affected what I call proportionately or disproportionately. So I'm going to pick a random person in the room. Who will be a random person in the room? Lisbeth. If I do an assessment on Lisbeth of her neuropsychological skills, I'm going to predict that imagine these are little matchsticks, all her little matchsticks are all going to be pretty much the same length. So she's going to be as good in her memory skills as in her attentional skills, as in her language skills, or whatever. But we know in many people who have genetic disorders, they might have mostly strengths and then a few areas of weakness. And unless we look at those, we're not going to pick these up. If I just take the average here, I'm not going to pick up those two guys. And this is the pattern that we see in people with TSC. Some things that are really good, some things that are really bad, some things that are average. And this is what mums and dads tell us. Well, he's very good at doing this, but he's rubbish at doing something else. And it's because the neuropsychological strengths and weaknesses are so disproportionately affected. And we cannot tell that from just looking at people and from just looking at their abilities. And so that's what we're trying to do. We evaluate their neuropsychological skills to try and get a sense of that profile. And the most common bits affected in TSC are in these, what we call anterior and subcortical functions, so-called executive processing skills. Memory is affected a lot as well, but attentional and executive skills are really the key challenges that we see in daily life. This is just another way to show some of those. We talk about regulatory mechanisms. I'm not going to go into the detail given my time. Attentional control mechanisms, and then these goal-directed mechanisms, and they are often very problematic. I've already said dual tasking. For most people with TSC, if you're going to have one deficit, this is the deficit you're likely to have, doing two things at the same time. So one of my mantras is all men and most people with TSC have dual tasking difficulties, right? It's a good way to remember it. Very common, often not evaluated, typically clinical psychologists or neuropsych people, they use a range of tools, and I've mentioned attention, memory, and then some of these executive skills. And I just wanted to make sure that you all understand what I mean by some of these. So maybe we have time, maybe we don't. The reason these are important, when we talk to people with TSC and when we evaluate them, they tell us that this is how it often manifests. You don't present with a neuropsychological deficit by sitting there and I can say, oh my goodness, you have an attentional deficit. But I can see that maybe you're struggling in school or getting in trouble, or you're struggling in the workplace and inconsistencies, and you might appear stubborn and willful and deliberate, particularly when you have kind of inflexibility in your brain. You want things to be done in a particular way and you get upset if you can't. very inconsistent and variable behavior. This is a very typical pattern in TSC. You can do it one day and the next day you can't. You can do it 1 week and the next week you can't. And then teachers get upset and they say, but you were able to do this last week. What's wrong this week? When in fact, that's part of the dysexecutive presentation of that person, but in fact, adult. We see it in adults as well. And often, when there's then a demand on the brain, people present with anxiousness or aggression, and it really can affect their relationships in major ways as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip all the games that I was going to make you do. I'm going to make you do at least one. Planning. Let's just do a little planning game, and then I'll wrap up. Planning is the brain's ability to... We think about kind of memory as kind of knowledge of the past, and planning is knowledge about the future. In a way, and many people with TSC struggle with planning. So one of the simple games that we use is called the Tower of London. So you have to imagine that there's like a pegboard and little balls. And you can put the little balls on the peg. So here you can see at the bottom 2 pegs and a third one. And what we say to kids and to adults is to say, I want you to tell me how many moves do I need to make the bottom one look like the top one. You can only move 1 ball at a time. So what do you think do we need to do to make the bottom one look like the top one? I just take the blue one and I put it there, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's just 1 move, okay? Here's another one. How many moves do I need to make the bottom one look like the top one? Oh my goodness, this is supposed to be an easy one, people. So you can only move 1 ball at a time. So you probably have to move this one there, then that one there, then this one there. Does that make sense? 1, 2, 3 moves, okay? So here's the last one. How many moves to make the bottom one look like the top one? So if you're standing in the front, you would see everyone going. So the answer doesn't matter, but what you're doing is planning. You're saying, so if I do this, then I need to do that, and then I need to do this before I can do that, otherwise I won't be able to do. That's planning. And for many people with TSC, that's really, really hard. And so interventions for these things, I'm not going to talk about the detail, but the short answer is we don't just assess these things to assess them, we can intervene. For all these deficits that we talked about, there are things we can do. There are some accommodations we can make. If people struggle, we can help them. And it's right to start with accommodations. There are some general strategies by which we're just going to reduce the load on the brain to make it easier for people to do these things. And we do it particularly by helping them practice to overlearn and make things as automatic as possible. It's like learning to drive a car. And then there are some skill-specific strategies for each of these things that I've mentioned. And in the interest of time, we're not going to have time to talk about it now, but I'm happy to talk about it during the break or in the afternoon if we have time. So just to end up on a word on where we are with research, people are very interested in can we use mTOR inhibitors to treat TAND manifestations. You're going to hear this afternoon about some studies that have been done trying to address different medication approaches. We've also just finished a little pilot study in the UK, which Julian Sampson presented. And what we did was we used everolimus in adults with TSC who had neuropsychological deficits, like the ones I've just mentioned to you. And we had a placebo group, and we had people on everolimus. They were treated for 6 months. And the short answer, and our findings have literally just come out. We observed 2 things. First, that all people with TSC, even those who had placebo, showed significant gains just in learning because they've become familiar with what we're expecting. Perhaps they've become less anxious, they know what to expect. So just through learning effects, 44% of people in the study showed significant gains in their neuropsychological tests. So lesson number one for all of us, use the predictability, use the helping people settle in. Don't expect things to be happening the first time when most people with TSC might feel overwhelmed by task demands. So that's, I think, a really important clinical lesson. But the second observation, which we were very interested was, we also saw that in the people who took everolimus, 70% of the people in the trial showed significant improvements in their neuropsychological skills. So over and above the learning effects, we saw added value of everolimus to help people with these very specific deficits. They all had IQs of 60 or above, and they were all adults. So this is not just a potential treatment for very young children, and I think that's a very interesting challenge for us to look at further and to do more research on. Lots more work to do. We need to know more about drugs for TAND. We need to know more about non-drugs for TAND. People really want tools. They don't want us to count a number. They want us to do things and give them tools. And of course, then people want to know, how early can we start? Can I start training my child while they're in the womb, once I know they have TSC? Or can I give them drugs while they're inside my belly still? I'm going to stop. Poor Lucy, I've taken a lot of her time already. But really, just to end back with Loren, I think part of the message for us today is not just to remember and celebrate all the great things and contributions that she's made to the field, but also I think as a reminder for all of us. She was 36, 2 beautiful children, highly successful, and I think the message to all of us is life is short and life is precious, and we never can predict when we might not have it anymore. And so I think that's just a way for all of us to focus on thinking what's important to me, what's important to us, what's wasting time, what's noise, and what are my priorities, and what are the important things in life. And I think it's something that I and my team and us as people who've worked with Loren have really become aware of. And I think it's an important message because it's universal. And it applies to all of us, and it applies to all of you as well. So my wish for you for the day, even if you go away with nothing other than thinking life is short and let's make the best use of it, then I think we've done a good job today. I'm going to pause there and hand over to Lucy, who has to do a little computer switch.